I'll give this opportunity to the Honorable Soipan Kudate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this very important policy on climate financing. Mr. Speaker, the benefits for Kenya for this, the policy direction that we are taking, Mr. Speaker, has been spoken to by the people who have spoken before me. But Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, the issue of protecting our environment and dealing with the adverse effects of climate change, Mr. Speaker, is direct protection and safeguarding of some of the very critical principles of our Constitution of 2010, Mr. Speaker, key of which is the need for us to have a certain minimum threshold of forest cover in our country, Mr. Speaker, and as we speak, the statistics are very dismal. I know we are below 2%, yet the threshold that we have set for ourselves as a nation stands at 10%. Mr. Speaker, this particular policy will go towards supporting our Vision 2030 in terms of increasing our adaptive capacity and resilience to climate change. Mr. Speaker, it is very promising to see that this is a policy that will guide us into a pathway, Mr. Speaker, where we will be talking about the need to mobilize both domestic and international climate finance resources and increase financial flows towards mitigating the effects of climate change in Kenya. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about climate change, somebody has spoken before me, Mr. Speaker, stating clearly, and I couldn't agree more, the effects, the adverse effects of climate change have no choice of who to hit, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the saddest thing for me in this country is the fact that every time we talk about protecting our natural resources, the matter is trivialized into a political issue. Mr. Speaker, speaking from my own backyard in Narok County, Mr. Speaker, we have the Mau Forest. I think 2 days ago, there were pictures circulating in the social media because I know, Mr. Speaker, this kind of policy arose from an assessment which was done, Mr. Speaker, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but we don't even need to do assessments, Mr. Speaker, to know that we are standing at a very, very dicey situation. As a country, as a nation, Mr. Speaker, as a partner, in the regional, within East Africa, within the world, Mr. Speaker. And what I was saying is that it saddens me that when we talk about the need to protect our natural resources, the issues are trivialized, and people begin to talk about politics. That when we talk about protecting the Mau Forest, we are hitting at one particular person. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we have been told here, it is very clear for all of us to see, Mr. Speaker, that when the Mara River dries, because that is the picture I was going to talk about, it is circulating even today in the social media. The Mara River has dried up, the impact of which is a diminished food security. And that will not affect anyone. It does not even just affect the people who are living next to the Mara River. It affects each and every individual. And we know that the Mara River, and I'm just giving this as an example because we've been given, examples of so many other of our water bodies, which are drying up. Some of them are swelling up due to siltation, Mr. Speaker, and rising levels of, the sea level rising, Mr. Speaker. This one is going to eat into all of us. And we will have nowhere for our kids to grow into. Mr. Speaker, I want to support this policy very boldly, Mr. Speaker, and really want to say that even some of the resources that we are going to mobilize, both domestically and internationally or from whichever source, much of which should be pumped into reaching out and doing those simple things that are going to contribute to the increase in our forest cover. Even before we talk about these big terms or big terminologies of carbon cover and so many other things. Mr. Speaker, we need to go back to the basics of how are our forests happening, Mr. Speaker. When you fly over some of our, very critical water catchment areas, it is very devastating. Mr. Speaker, and the adverse effects that have been spoken about here, droughts and floods, which we don't need assessments to be able to know that they're happening in our country. Mr. Speaker, from my village, I can't remember the last time I saw rain. Yet, we were able to predict when the rains would come, and farmers would be able to plow their fields and, very precisely, know that the rains would come at a particular time. And that contributes, has a ripple effect in protecting the food security of our country. But we can no longer plan for that because our droughts are unpredictable, the water sources have diminished, even the water qualities have diminished, Mr. Speaker, and it is time for Kenyans to wake up and smell the coffee and know that we have no place for our children to grow into, such that even as we support this kind of policy, we should really follow through, and I want to agree with Honorable Wamalwa, what he said, that the Committee on Environment, our newly appointed CS, mine is to challenge them. This is an issue of priority. If we are talking about putting our priorities clearly as a country, I think the need to protect our natural resources, the need to wake up and address the issue of climate change should be top on our priority. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the issues of health, increased costs of health because of the adverse effects of climate change, it will affect everybody. It will not matter where you're coming from or which is your political affiliation. This one will affect all of us. When you talk about reduced agricultural production, this affects the livelihood, which is the mainstay for Kenyans, and it will not choose where to hit. It will hit all of us. Mr. Speaker, when you talk about the decline in the quantity and quality of water, it will affect all of us. And Mr. Speaker, it is obvious that all these things have a cost implication for our government. Mr. Speaker, as we speak right now, the government has to devise means and ways in which to mitigate for the food shortages, Mr. Speaker, how to mitigate on all these adverse effects of climate change, and it is a burden which again is going to hit on the table of each and every Kenyan. Mr. Speaker, with those few remarks, I want to support this policy and really to want to see how this will be followed through in terms of implementation and to see Kenyans going to the basics. Well, one honorable member said we need even to go back to our children, teaching them about the small habits and practices that are going to show protection and care of our environment. Because we've been told here, which is very true, nature can be very forgiving, and it has a way of coming back to it into all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.